whether or not you make the sale, whether or not the meeting goes well, you make a lasting relationship with that person, it's all experience points. Give yourself a little credit for getting yourself out there. If you can sense it, it's probably sensed by them as well, and it's very effective and helpful to label that thing right in the beginning. Reps make the difference, and whether or not you're good at something can only be determined by if you have done the reps. What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to another powerful episode of the Creative Journal Podcast. I'm your host, Andy of MMG Design. If you guys don't know me, I am a fractional design and marketing strategist located in Columbus, Ohio, and I've helped over 50 business owners build and scale a website and marketing strategy. And this is entry number 65 of the Creative Journal Podcast. I'm titling this episode 4 Lessons from My First 100 Sales Meetings. So I had a moment earlier this week where I entered my 50th client into my CRM. And I thought, okay, this is kind of an interesting little milestone. I figured I've had at least 3 or 4 meetings with every single one of these clients. And sales meetings, at least I would say I have around a 50% success rate as well. So if I've had, just by sheer force of math and statistics, if I've had 50 clients in the CRM, 50% success rate, then, I've had at least 100 sales meetings. And it's also a good round, even sexy number that I can push towards. But I want to share with you guys my 4 main takeaways, my 4 biggest lessons as an introvert from 100 sales meetings. And I never thought I would have the credibility, or even now there's the imposter syndrome, but I don't care what people think. But the imposter syndrome, I'm considering myself giving advice on sales or even talking about sales. But the way I see this podcast is that it's a self-retro of me examining my own mistakes and what I can learn from them. And like something I'll expand on this is that and this is part of the advice that I have to myself kind of post hoc, is doing things is so much higher value than learning things. And those go hand in hand, but you can watch Alex Hormozy until you're blue in the face, or Grant Cardone, or any of these other people that are online that have a high dopamine level in terms of scrolling and seeing their confidence and their bravado. But that's not what a lot of this is. A lot of this is getting started and making it part of your identity. And that's a big James Clear sort of aphorism, is, you cast votes for who you want to become based on the actions that you take every day. And so when I say my 4 biggest lessons from my first 100 sales meetings, it's really just what I've learned after having done it. It's not that I'm qualified to I think I am qualified to give advice to someone that hasn't had 0 sales meetings just by quantity of experience. But when I say my 4 biggest lessons from my first 100 sales meetings, it really is just it's literally just memorizing what's been effective, and, bringing those lessons into a more word tangible format that I'm sharing with you guys now. So I have the 4 listed down here. I'm going to go through them one at a time. I'm going to try and keep this to around 10 to 15 minutes because I know that's in terms of attention spans, and honestly, in terms of just effectiveness, I think it shouldn't take longer than that. So my first biggest lesson is to have an outcome in mind, but don't push towards it. Focus on the conversation and not the outcome. So one of the biggest things I did when I first started a sales meeting is I was over prepared, be super nervous, anxious, and I would have a very black and white definition of what success or failure looked like based on how I wanted the interaction to go. I realize now there are cases where you want that to be, and this is all situational, context based. So when I say 4 lessons from my first 100 sales meetings, taking into account if you're not a salesperson, or you just want to get better at communicating or just talking in general, these lessons could be applicable to you either way. And the context is king. So when I say don't have an outcome in mind, but don't push towards it, I think it's important to define what success looks like when you're walking away from that meeting with that person, having done your research, having known a respectable amount about them. And this changes based on the interaction. So if I'm a business owner looking to sell a service to another business owner, the conversation is a lot different than a business owner looking to just connect or network with other people. I still think these lessons apply, but a really helpful question I have asked beforehand is to just say, okay, what does a home run success, this was the highlight of my day meeting, look like? And how can I engineer my actions towards that? I mean, obviously, you don't want to push towards what you say and re-engineer the conversation, but you want to focus on the conversation and not that outcome. But it's important to know what it is. So it could be a sale, it could just be a good conversation, it could be getting to know more about that person. But and this doesn't look like comfort, it doesn't look like a good, smooth, free flowing conversation a lot of the times. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. And this kind of tailing off the first key of advice is that if you can make the first 5 to 10 minutes or moments, if you can make the first 5 to 10 minutes as uncomfortable as possible, the rest of the conversation ends up going so much smoother. So if you think about it beforehand, what are the biggest animosities that you have when you're bringing up that you are scared to bring up in this meeting? Could be budget, finances, timelines, maybe something that you need clarity on from them that may make put them out of their comfort zone. Obviously, be conversationally respectful, but what's the biggest thing you want to get out right of the way? Just eat the vegetables in the beginning. And that's gone so far for me is just identifying what that is. So otherwise, there's not this just hanging thing between you guys. There's this point of tension that you can both kind of feel that you both know is there. Um, so don't be afraid to label and point those things out. So yeah, so if it's a meeting that's revolved around conflict resolution or if it's purely on sales, there's some kind of overcome that you have to come or that they have to come to meet and make the relationship good moving forwards. So just point that out in the beginning, whether it is budget, whether it is you feel they question your credibility, because a lot of the times, and I don't think I'm alone in this, is that the instincts that you have and things that will come up in your mind are probably being felt by the other person as well. And this is what's learned through reps and through just gaining social maturity and conversational awareness. If you're thinking something, there's that little dangling thread of, excuse me, maybe I question their credibility a little bit, or there's this one little overcome I have. There's this bit of a red flag both of you aren't addressing. If you can sense it, it's probably sensed by them as well, and it's very effective and helpful to label that thing right in the beginning. So that's lesson number one. Lesson number two is that reps make a difference. And I kind of touched on this in the beginning, but I am case study zero, patient zero of watching others live my dreams, watching others become the person I wanted to become. And this was even the case today. Like, I had a very slow start this morning. I didn't want to go on the run. I didn't want to get the day started. It was Saturday morning. I had a call at 11 and I just didn't want to get started. And I'll tell you guys a story. The past versions of myself have always been, I'm being productive if I am learning. And there's certainly a time in your life when that is true. And learning takes many different forms, but the most die hard, tried and true, the most true form of learning is by doing. And reps make a difference. So when I do this post hoc of 4 lessons for my first 100 sales meetings, then you guys can understand that even the lessons that I've learned from this have all just been from experience. I'm not saying that I'm better at any of this than all of you. Obviously, if I've had 50 clients go through my CRM, there's some level of credibility there for the business, but reps make the difference. And whether or not you're good at something can only be determined by if you have done the reps, whether you've done the experience. Ali Abdaal has this great thing called gaining experience points. So your metric of success in the beginning, whether or not you tie your productivity outcomes to it, whether or not it ended up benefiting you in your career, you avoid the sunk cost fallacy of doing these things by just saying, okay, the only thing I'm optimizing for is experience. And whether this meeting or this sales call or anything, whether this goes positively or negatively, I'm getting the experience points either way. So that's motivation to just get yourself out there and get the reps. Get the reps over time, because that is just so important. And it's literally just the analogy of the stone cutter. So this artist Michelangelo was just chipping away at this stone hundreds and hundreds of times, and in the minutia, from the moment to moment, from strike to strike, there's no difference. But then over time, when it all collapses, he knows it wasn't the first 500 hours he spent making those chips and all of a sudden the last one did it. He knows it wasn't that last one. He knows it was the 500 hours beforehand. So when you reach a milestone like 100 meetings, or even your first meeting, that in itself is a milestone. What it took to get you there is what should be credited, and not just showing up. So knowing that it takes the reps, knowing that it takes the time, it takes the investment, and it's not easy, give yourself credit because building those up over time. And also lower your standard for what makes a meeting. So I was very blessed to live in Marysville, Ohio for the past 8 months of this career. It was very close to Columbus. And I made myself very, very available to meetings. And what you will come to find is that, dude, there is so many times where you'll walk out of a meeting and it will feel unproductive. It will feel like, wow, I just wasted an hour of my life talking to someone that there's going to be no beneficiary from. And you'll drive an hour away to just a horrible networking event that you feel like you got no value out of. And that can happen. But you can't make that the metric of success. If you want to learn these things, if you want to improve your verbal agility, get better at speaking, communicate better, selling your services, selling yourself, learning what other people are doing, you have to get the reps. So that's lesson number 2, and it's one I am learning and building on every single day. Number 3, do not attach your self-worth to the outcome. If the biggest person you're afraid of is the story you tell yourself if the biggest person you are afraid of is you and the story you tell yourself afterwards, then that's the first problem you need to solve. So I was patient zero for this as well. I'm very much a victim of negative self-talk. So if I didn't reach that outcome that I had in my mind beforehand, or if I didn't muster up the courage in that moment, didn't come prepared enough to feel like it was a productive conversation, I was the one bringing that on myself. And this is something I won't dive too deep into because it can be a rabbit hole, and I know we all have emotions of negative self-talk and low self-confidence, but that's why you have to orient your metric of success from the beginning and don't attach your self-worth to the outcome. Because guys, whether or not you make the sale, whether or not the meeting goes well, you make a lasting relationship with that person, it's all experience points. And give yourself a little credit for getting yourself out there because guys, there's so many people that just have not taken upon themselves to even start. If you have a modicum of self-improvement gene in you, if you are putting yourself out there, you're going to networking events, you're starting a business, you have even a curiosity, you're reading, you are so much further ahead than 80% of the population in terms of self-improvement and wanting to be a better version of yourself. And we are our own biggest critic. We are our loudest voice of unreason. There's nothing I can say. There's nothing you guys can hear in a podcast that'll convince you that you deserve the world. And if you speak negatively to yourself after a sales meeting, or you didn't bring up the hard conversation, or you didn't even follow any of these advices that I'm laying out now, because to be honest, there's times when I'm not consistent with all this stuff either. That's how this stuff works. Don't attach your self-worth to the outcome or compare yourself to others because that's going to discourage you from wanting to get back at it in the future. So that's lesson number 3. And lesson number 4 is one I've talked about several times on this show and in speaking gigs for some high school kids that I did for the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. The whole topic of my talk, and this is the 4th point of this podcast and final one to wrap up, was all about fear setting. So what is the worst possible thing that can possibly happen? So if you follow this to its natural extreme, if you guys don't know what fear setting is, it is the Tim Ferriss method of defining what the worst possible thing could look like so that you acknowledge in the end that it is not nearly as bad as you ever could have thought. So if you take this to its natural extreme, say you show up late to the meeting. So how could this meeting go as bad as it could be? Okay, so you show up late, you stutter, you make a totally bad impression. This client drops you. Say that's a $5,000 a month recurring client. You're now out $5,000 and this person doesn't like you anymore. And this person just left and you're sitting in the restaurant. What happened? Okay. What do you have to work for now? Who is your biggest what resources do you have to not just bounce back but to become a better version of a salesperson, of a business owner, of a designer, a creative? What resources do you have to push yourself forward? Because the situation that just happened to you, maybe it's your fault. Maybe it is. Good. So take accountability. But you are where you are now because of what happened. And there's nothing else you can do. It's just a fundamental mind shift when you realize this happened. The next thing is the next thing. Any time I spend detracting or scolding myself from the actions of the past or whatever just happened is just setting me further back from reaching that ideal outcome that I was looking for. So you have to take things Sometimes it's just counterintuitive sort of belief. When you take things to their natural negative extreme, you realize that it's not nearly as bad as you ever could have thought. And it's just such an empowering situation to put yourself in, because it exposes you to that. It's like acknowledging that one day we're going to pass away. One day, bad things are going to happen. And you free up your mind to just allow that as a possibility. The resources that you spend worrying about these things are now directed towards a productive manner when you acknowledge that these things can happen. So you spend less time worrying about it. You're just a more productive, laid back, acknowledging, understanding person. And that's one of the biggest things I've learned from these 100 reps, is the worst thing that can possibly happen, that feeling of anxiety you get beforehand, that is a good thing. Because A, it means you're alive, but B, it means that you feel the consequences of what you're about to do. And when you fear set and you acknowledge beforehand that the worst possible outcome of the situation, if this client drops me, if I stutter over my words, if I don't elaborate my speech correctly, you can take accountability and just acknowledge beforehand that this happened because of me, and move forwards from there. So put the blame on yourself in a positive way and use it as a way to improve. So that's the fourth lesson. One more thing I'll touch on is preparation. So I've seen a lot of different, and you guys have probably heard a lot of different areas in which, you should prepare for hours and weeks ahead of time for meetings that are big, and then less time. I found that for me, 30 minutes, roundabout 15 to 30 minutes, depending on the size of the meeting. Like I said, context is king, but 30 minutes is better than 3 hours in almost every scenario, because the moment you start studying the other person like it's a test, and I found myself at least getting very focused on that one specific outcome rather than enjoying the conversation, staying in the moment, and being the best version of myself for that other person. So I would say check your basics, know a little bit about their history, how you're going to approach it, maybe one or two, cap it at that, topics or inside jokes that you may want to bring up. And that's the 80/20. So that's the 80% of the preparation. That's the 20% you can do. That'll get you 80% of the results. So those are my 4 biggest lessons that I've learned from my first 100 sales meetings. Like I said, take these with a grain of salt, because I am learning. But my experience in these things, has led me to a place where even with imposter syndrome, I feel the accreditation to be able to make recommendations like this and to be able to share my learning. So to sum up, number 1 was to have an outcome in your mind, but don't push towards it. Number 2 was that reps make a huge difference and optimize for experience points. Number 3 is to not attach your self-worth to the outcome. Number 4 is to fear set. So put yourself in the worst possible scenario ahead of time in order to allocate the resources that you would have been previously worrying and wasting on deliberating about the future, and put those towards productive use. So thank you guys for tuning in. Again, this has been episode number 65 of the Creative Journal podcast. A little bit different of a format with a solo episode, and a bit more of a different take on sales as well from my first 100 sales meeting. So a little bit of a documenting milestone, but like I said, I feel like I have a few helpful insights to share that may be contrary to some of the Hormozy or Grant Cardone lessons that you may see out there. So thank you guys for tuning in. Again, we'll see you back next week. Next week on the agenda, we have a very special guest from Findlay, Ohio. I'm not going to reveal her name yet, but stay tuned on socials. And thank you guys for tuning in this week. Love you all, and we'll see you back next week on the Creative Journal podcast. Bye-bye.